Hello and welcome to another edition of Photographica Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Without you, this podcast has no meaning. I mean that. And I just wanted to say thanks to Chad Lalong, my old friend who produced the music for this podcast and all the links as well. And you can get in touch with Chad through his Twitter address at Chad Lalong. That is ChadLelong, Chad Lalong. And I just wanted to talk to you about the importance of subscription and rating. We need you to subscribe and rate. This is what we need, because without those, we don't get seen. And the more we get seen, the more we can do. So please, subscribe and rate us if you like what we're doing here. So, thank you very much for listening to Photographica Podcast. On with the show. Hi there, and welcome to an amazing Photographica Podcast conversation. This episode is with Heathcliff O'Malley, who has for the last 19 years been a staff or contract photographer at the Daily Telegraph. Heathcliff is noted for his coverage of 9/11, for the wider post 9/11 conflict in Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. He has, by his own admission, lived 1,000 lives. Heathcliff spoke absolutely frankly and movingly about what it's like to be on the ground in these situations and facing the consequences that invariably will occur. His goal, as you'll hear him say, is to record the truth, record important stories. And I just thought it was fascinating listening to him talk about this with real humility and awareness of what it is to live the life of a photographer whose mission is to capture the truth and represent the voice of voiceless people. Don't forget, you can see some of Heathcliff's pictures on the Photographica website. That's asprinting.net/Photographica, where I'll also post some useful links to more of his work. For now, enjoy this conversation with Heathcliff O'Malley. So yes, hi Heathcliff O'Malley. Thanks a lot for coming along today.
My pleasure.
I just wanted to talk to you because you're the first photojournalist that I've spoken to, and a lot of people who are into photography, their first contact with photography may have been through photojournalism of some sort. You know, I mean, if you're talking about whether it was one of the great 20th century, Cartier-Bressons, Robert Cappers, and things like that. But going back, when is the first time you can remember being conscious of photography?
My mother kept cuttings, and I remember rummaging through her stuff, probably nosing around when I was, 6 or 7. And they were cuttings, I think, from the Observer and the Sunday Times of probably the last days of the Vietnam conflict.
Right.
And I remember there was a picture of somebody crying over a sort of bloodied body in the back of a truck, which I've seen since.
Yeah.
And I can't remember who it's by.
James Griffiths, wasn't it?
It was colour, so I'm not too sure if it was him or Page.
Right.
But it was one or the other. It wasn't a McCullen picture. And so I think that was really my first contact, and I think when you're little and you get sort of struck by images like that. So there were several pictures, but that's the one that sort of comes to mind. Why
did she cut them out?
I've no idea. I've never really asked her, but she'd kept them.
Right.
She keeps a lot of things, but that was one of the things that she'd obviously kept and maybe stuck with her.
So she was a serial keeper of
I've still got her receipts from the first TV set she bought, I think. So.
And that picture, because I'm pretty sure from the way that you describe it, I've seen that picture.
Yeah.
And I wonder what it is that drew you. What when you think of that picture is, it's a slightly psychological question, but what emotions came to mind when you were a kid? It must be, what age do you think you were?
Well, I was probably about, like I said, probably 6 or 7.
Yeah.
And I think seeing somebody covered in blood and somebody crying over them is quite a powerful thing at that age. I mean, one would hope it's quite a powerful image for somebody of any age, but I'm not too sure nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, I remember being obsessed with some pictures of of one of the first heart transplants, which was a Sunday Times feature, and I don't know what it was about that, but and certainly I'm no surgeon now, but there is something. It's not just a macabre attachment or whatever you call it, attraction. There is something else in there. Do you think that there was
something out of the ordinary, isn't it?
Yeah.
Apart from the blood and everything else, and I guess with that picture, it's not only the fact that as a little boy I was probably seeing death, an image of death for the first time.
Yeah.
But it was also an image of death in a place that was obviously not home.
Yeah. Quite.
So there was, a lot to that image that would sort of make you sort of look twice, and I guess it's just that sort of fascination and inquisitiveness that a child would have as well.
And so where did that go from there then? I mean,
well, I think I was always quite political,
right,
and politically aware, and then I guess in my sort of early mid-teens, the whole Central America thing was going on. And I think for a while I wanted to be a journalist, and I kind of wanted to right the wrongs that the West were doing in places like Nicaragua and whatever, sort of old cliche. And I became aware of the likes of McCullen and Page, and started to get an interest in photography.
Was there a point? Was photography a tool to expose the wrongs of the West, or was photography, or like McCullen says, it's like a toothbrush; it gets the job done? Or why did you divert to photography rather than writing?
I'm not sure,
right?
To be honest, maybe. I guess photographs are sort of instant and more accessible. And perhaps as a teenager, it's a lot easier to, you're flicking through pages and you notice images more. And whilst reading is slightly more laborious, isn't it? And you can you look through pictures and instantly you can kind of get an idea of what's going on somewhere. Whilst when you're if you're having to read through text, it can take quite a long time, and maybe that attracted me to it. I wouldn't pretend that I was some sort of child prodigy, that I just sort of stumbled into it really and decided that that's what I wanted to do, and then spent quite a long time in a sort of convoluted way getting there.
Right. So what was your path to?
Well, bizarrely, I cycle couriered in my early 20s. And I one day delivered some suits to a fashion photographer and started sort of delivering packages occasionally to him, and he noticed that I had an old Canon AE1 sort of slung over my shoulder, and got chatting. And about a year later I moved over to one of these professional photo labs in Camden called Primary Colour.
I remember it well,
And I thought, well, I want to get into photography, but why don't I do this first? I was just trying to think of ways to get into the industry. So I spent a couple of years there, got trained up as a QLab, Kodak sort of technician and all of that sort of stuff. And, it was great because every day I was looking at photographs of all sorts of different photographs. There were, still life photographers and photojournalists and stock photographers. There was sort of every kind of photography you could think of. And what was quite interesting actually is I was talking across the counter to one of the photographers one day, and I asked him if he knew one of the other photographers that came in, and he said, No, and why would I? A camera's just a pen. You know, architects, lawyers, journalists, so many people use a pen. A camera's no different.
Right.
And that struck me really, and has stuck with me.
Yeah.
And then one day, the fashion photographer that I'd met, a couple of years before as a courier, came in to get some film developed and said, "Oh, look, funny seeing you here." And a few months later, he phoned me at work and asked me to come in and see him, and offered me a job as an assistant.
And you weren't looking for it?
Well, I was, but didn't really have any idea of, by that point I had friends of mine that had started sort of assisting fashion photographers for free and all of this kind of nonsense. And I wasn't really sure what I was going to do at that point. And then he came along, and next thing I knew, I was in Milan photographing the fashion shows. And
right.
Yeah. So that's where it all started for me, really.
And so, coming forward, then you've been working for the Telegraph for how long now?
19 years.
19
this
years.
year.
So it's pretty much from there to
almost. Yeah. I mean, I worked for this photographer for about a year, and then moved because it wasn't what I wanted to do, and I'd often go backstage and be trying to get pictures of the supermodel, sort of, like reportage style pictures. I didn't want to do the glossy sort of makeup pictures. I wanted, so I used to get told off. I remember Carla Bruni trying to get me kicked out once because she had a fag in one hand and a glass of champagne in the other and rollers in her hair, and she sort of almost looked like something out of Coronation Street. I thought it was quite funny, and I was taking pictures, just trying to get something a bit different, and she didn't really like it.
Right.
And so I wanted to be a photojournalist and cover important stuff, and fashion just is so not important as much as people like to think it is. So, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I might share your opinion on that. I mean, I think there's great work done in fashion photography.
Oh yeah, totally.
I mean,
Atherton's a great
you
hero of mine, and Norman Parkinson, and there's a few
Horst and people, and others, but I know what you mean. So out of there, so then you went to the Telegraph, and you're straight on the payroll as a sort of staff photographer.
Yeah, I've been. So I was there for about 18 months as a freelancer, and I managed to get in there by taking over the role from somebody else as their High Court photographer.
Right.
So in those days, they had a photographer who was based at the Royal Courts of Justice down on the Strand, and that's what I did 5 days a week.
So what was that? What would that entail? Just standing outside the court
every day, finding out what cases were going on, going into those courts to see and identify those people, talking to the journalists, and then trying to get these pictures of these people leaving and arriving.
Right.
It was pretty mundane. It taught me how to walk backwards and take a photo at the same time, which can be useful.
And you'd be on your own.
It depended on what sort of case was going on. I mean, and sometimes there were hordes of people. So I did that for about 18 months, and then Kosovo came up, and I think I was the last name on a list of photographers they were calling to go to Montenegro. And I said, yeah, sure. I was just desperate to go and do something real, I guess I thought at the time.
So what was that? What? I mean, that sounds quite straightforward, but presumably, I don't know if it's different now, but you've been working in court, on court step photography for 18 months, and then you get a call saying go to Kosovo, which is quite apart from anything else, is a completely different kind of photography, a completely different kind of engagement with what you're doing. Yeah. Was there any preparation? I mean, did the Telegraph, did they care for you in that sense? Did they get you ready for the trip, or did they just say fuck off and go?
I don't think in those days there was. I mean, now you have to go on training courses every 3 years. With some of these ex sort of SAS blokes that scream at you with a balaclava on or whatever. But in those days, it wasn't.
Right.
there wasn't any training. You know, I jumped on a plane to Croatia, to Dubrovnik, and got a taxi to the Montenegrin border, which then had the Serbian army was based there. And I remember seeing the very first buildings I'd ever seen bullet holes in. You know, apart from, you know, obviously there were a few bullet holes in the odd church and government building in the centre of London from the Blitz. But yeah, it was the first time I'd really sort of seen destruction. I thought, gosh, you know, I was quite excited, I think, really. You know.
Were you with anybody?
Well, not on the way in, and then I met a reporter once I got to Podgorica, which is the capital of Montenegro, and there was a few other journalists there from the BBC and Newsday and whatever. So,
but I'm intrigued. But as far as the Telegraph are concerned, they just said go.
Yeah, I mean that's always been the way it works, really. I mean, especially, you know, if you're in a rush to go, you know, it's news. There's no real forward planning.
No, but they didn't say, they didn't give you a sort of an objective or no, if you can get this,
go and meet this reporter and, you know,
see what happens.
Yeah, and there wasn't a massive amount to do when we got there. I mean, you know, go and photograph, you know, sort of refugees that had come over from Kosovo or whatever, and but then an opportunity came up to get into Kosovo itself, and John Swain, who was a very well-known journalist and took his own pictures as well, photographer, who worked for the Sunday Times, had just got in to Kosovo, and it was quite a big deal. He was like the first British journalist, I think, to really get in there, and we were like, gosh, you know, we've got to do something. And then the opportunity came up. You know, we found a contact who could get us over the border, and it was myself and a Telegraph journalist called Mike Smith, and a reporter, Matt McAllister, who was working for Newsday, a New York-based newspaper at the time. And the three of us travelled in on foot, sort of across Serbian lines into sort of rebel-held Kosovo, really, part of the KLA. They were the Albanian sort of freedom fighters, or whatever you want to call them.
And did you feel like you were being sort of, well, blooded is probably the wrong word, but, you know, these guys were more experienced than you, and that you were
No, I mean, to be honest, I don't think any of us, you know,
right,
there was, you know, the three of us, I don't think between us we really had any experience at all. We're all quite sort of new to, we're of varying ages, but none of us had really done anything.
Right.
So it wasn't like I had a somebody, a sort of mentor to sort of care for me and give me advice of what to do. But it was a fairly quiet trip. There was no action or anything. You know, we stayed with these rather bureaucratic rebels and sort of went to visit the front line, but didn't really see much, but got some good pictures. And after a few days, we were, you know, sort of slipped out again back into Montenegro, and I'd shot 3 rolls of film.
Right.
I mean, it was, you know, and but it was a massive deal back in Britain, and my pictures ended up on the front of the Telegraph and this New York newspaper, sort of simultaneously, and it was quite a big thing, and that, from being the sort of lowest of the low court photographer, suddenly I had people in the office coming up and shaking my hand, and people I'd never seen before or knew of or had heard of.
Right.
And it won me a contract at the paper.
And do you think that contract was a sort of recognition of your ingenuity or your skill as a photographer, or both? I mean, it sounds like...
I think as a photojournalist or photographer or reporter or whatever, I think the main thing is being there. I really do, because, you know, you can be the greatest photographer in the world, but unless you're in the right place at the right time, it really doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
If that's going to be your chosen sort of field, you know.
Yeah.
And the pictures weren't great. I still didn't really know what I was doing at that point. You know, I was still fairly unskilled. When I look back at what I shot then, I think, for heaven's sake, you know, if only I knew the little bit more that I know now, then I could have done a better job of it.
Yeah, but you say that, but at that moment, those pictures were the most important pictures.
Yeah, and nobody else had the pictures, and it meant a lot. I mean, a different sort of job. A couple of years later, I was photographing this skydiver who decided to test Da Vinci's design for a parachute. And it was completely bonkers. And this thing weighed 80 kilos. It was made of wood and canvas.
I think I remember this.
And it worked. It was over South Africa in Kruger Park, and I was on a helicopter photographing him. And it was on the second generation of Kodak Canon digital cameras, 2 megapixel press camera. And I shot it, and the Telegraph used it really big. And then National Geographic wanted it, so I sent it to them. And then their sister publication, was it Geographic Traveller or something, got hold of me, and they wanted it. And then they got really snooty. Oh, you know, we only use slide film. We don't use digital. You know, haven't you got anything better? And I said, well, look, you know, A, they're the only pictures out there of this, and B, if it's good enough in National Geographic, I'm sure it's good enough for you. And that was kind of the end of the argument, really, you know.
So, just on that, just something you mentioned there, when you said that, so the Telegraph used the pictures initially because you were employed by them to do this, but then you say National Geographic picked it up, and did they pick it up? I mean, does the Telegraph own those rights, or do you own the rights?
Well, because I'm a contractor, not a staff person, I keep my copyright.
Right.
I mean, in some ways, you know, I've been there 19 years. It would be lovely to have a pension and a healthcare plan and all my equipment provided for me. But as a freelancer, technically, I have to buy all my own cameras. And you know, most freelancers keep their copyright. There are some newspapers that have grabbed the copyright of their photographers, and the photographers are too sort of scared or intimidated to stand up for themselves. And not just the right-wing press. I mean, some newspapers you wouldn't expect it from do exactly the same thing. So in that respect, I've been quite fortunate that I own the rights to everything I shoot.
Everything you've ever shot? Yeah.
I mean, the only problem is the stuff I shot on film, I used to put into the library at the Telegraph, and they're probably all in a cardboard box in a warehouse in Dagenham or something now. Right. So all I really have is, I guess, anything I shot on neg abroad, and then my digital work from sort of late 99 onwards. Right.
So, and is that something that you're looking to, you know, I don't know what the right word is to monetize, you know, the fact that you've got this history of, I mean, you're not very old, but, you know, in the years to come, you know...
to be brutally honest, I think, you know, a picture of Kate Moss at a Burberry show from 2003 in Milan has probably got more value than a reportage picture from a conflict. I mean, that's the sort of sad truth of it. So, I mean, I've always syndicated my work, and I've changed agency recently, but it's not, you know, you know, it's a little bit of money, and it's nothing to be sort of sneered at, but it's not going to provide me in old age or anything. Really.
No, it's not. But so, I mean, I'm just trying to get a feel for how life has changed, because it's. I mean, it sounds to me the photographers I know, I mean, journalists I know, are things seem to be much more organised for you before, and now things are fragmented. I think that's because a lot of papers and news organisations have let their photographers go, and you're one of the last people who is picking up daily work from a newspaper. You're certainly the last one I know.
I mean, there are, you know, very few of us now. I mean, I think, you know, some of the tabloids still have a few staff.
Yeah. I mean, there's royal. I mean, there's like actually that's but there isn't that much. The commitment, the effect of say Alamy and other what do you call picture libraries, is that impacted on you?
Oh, well, not on me, but they've completely killed the industry.
Right.
I mean, some of the big agencies have, they've swallowed everything up, and they often shoot big sporting events for free, and
right,
and they've knocked down the price of images, and the resale value of an image now is a fraction of what it used to be, and photographers' rates haven't gone up in 20 years. If you look at what press photographers were earning 20 years ago, it's the same now, and in those days they were sort of earning what a doctor or a lawyer earns, and now it's completely different. But I mean, it's not just the agencies though; it's the nature of digital. I mean, when I worked for the fashion photographer, if a magazine wanted a picture, I would shoot a dupe of it. I'd do a copy neg of it or whatever, and go and get it developed, and you'd send off that one slide by courier to the magazine. They would scan it, and then it would come back sort of covered in gunk, and that was it. Nowadays, a digital image, you have no control over where it goes, and if you syndicate or send that image to somebody, it ends up going everywhere
without control, with
no control at all.
Yeah.
As soon as you release your image, you have completely lost control of it. And if you look around on the internet, there are bloggers and all sorts that just take your pictures and they manipulate them and sell them as prints. And
have you come across that?
Oh yeah, I mean, I've come across it. I mean, I've had emails from people who've rather flatteringly recognised pictures of mine that people have been sort of selling on Facebook or offering as prints and stuff. And people just pinch stuff and think there's nothing wrong with it.
And there's nothing you can do about that because
no, there isn't. And the government they brought in or trying to bring in orphan works laws that say that if you can't find the author of a copyrighted image or product within a certain length of time, then you can do what you want with it. And I think this is partly because of the internet and big internet-based companies wanting to use images without the restraints of having to pay people for them.
Yeah, I mean it's. I suppose there's a new realism, isn't there? Which is that these images exist in the wild, as it were, and if you can't trace back the owner of that image, then somebody has to be the owner. I mean, the nature of all is a vacuum, so commerce is going to say, well, if you can't prove who the owner is, then we'll own that. In Facebook, by buying Instagram, or just by by default, has a greater tenure over the images that people post there than the people do themselves who may have originated them. The whole thing has shifted from the assumed ownership, of the photographer to some sort of weird grey ownership where Facebook could actually make money from your image.
Yeah, I mean, there was something. I mean, there was a huge stink with Instagram a few years ago because quite a few very well-known photojournalists were using Instagram, and then Instagram tried to bring in a new copyright clause, and there was such a stink that they backtracked on that. And I know Facebook have done stuff in the past, but it's sometimes it's difficult. You can get rather excited by the small print, but then in fact often the small print is more about the ability to actually post the images in the first place, and so you have to be careful because you can get really excited and think, oh my god, what's going to happen? But then, I mean, as a professional you have to be very careful, but I think for the average punter, I mean, they have to be realistic and think, well, do Facebook really want to monetize, or is there really any value to a selfie I've done on holiday or whatever?
Speak for yourself. I just think that the younger photographers that I print for, don't give a shit about where their images end up. They're really much less concerned about it than we are.
Yeah.
And, I mean, going in age range down, you got photographers who are, say, 60 plus, who insist on putting a watermark on everything, you know, like their name on everything. Or, you know, I'm just saying, and are absolutely. I mean, I interviewed a guy called John Taberry recently for one of these podcasts, and he was one of the first photographers of the Clash and the Sex Pistols and things like that, and he's incredibly paranoid about the power of the internet to rob him of his images, and going and then coming down from there. And I'm not saying, I actually think he's got a perfectly good point, in fact, because people will, if there's a celebrity in there, if there's anything valuable in it, people will just rip it, you know, and so on. And coming down from there, people just seem to be getting less and less concerned as they get younger, to the point where we all say to our children, look, watch what you post on Facebook and all that, but in fact, they don't care. I mean, it's a, you know, I mean, I'm not saying I share their relaxed attitude to it, but it's a fact that Facebook and Instagram and all that are winning this argument about the value of images at large.
I mean, I think ultimately there's going to be a very small core of commercial photographers who make a living, and quite a good living, and then the rest will, you know, earn a pittance. I think that's the reality of it. I mean, I get, you know, young students who want to, you know, come and spend the day with me on work experience, or other photographers at the paper, and it's very difficult because you don't want to sort of crush their aspirations. But what do you tell them? I mean, you know, and it's still, you know, when it's good, it's the best job in the world, but it's a job that in reality isn't really going to last a lot longer. But whether you can make a living off it, I mean, I have children to support, and you know, there are some fantastic photographers out there who can't make a living anymore. You know, there's, you know, a great number of photographers that were once, you know, making pretty good money, doing really interesting assignments for news magazines, who are now spending their time teaching photography to housewives in Santa Barbara or whatever. You know, there's no money anymore as a, you know, for a lot of them.
Is that necessarily a bad thing? And I'm not saying that just because play devil's advocate, but sometimes, I mean, because I used to see this when I was doing my assistancy in, you know, advertising studios in the early 90s and so on, where photographers who'd been used to, you know, had a career of just the easiest, you know, the you know, London centre of the advertising industry, you know, money just pouring in, great big budgets and everything, and then suddenly, you know, people like Martin Sorrell and that came in and suddenly questioned why the budgets had to be so big, and everything got small, and then there was recessions and so on, and suddenly they looked like sheep caught in the headlights. You know, they couldn't believe the fat had been carved away like that.
Yeah.
But and then I think it culled out a lot of good photographers out of the industry, and that was a bad thing. But at the same time, I mean, do you think it could push you, say, just speaking about your own experience, could it push you into new and interesting ways that you can't see your future being sort of, you know, you like you say, you haven't got a pension, you haven't got you're not looked after by the Telegraph, so you're thinking about your future and things like that. And can you see that any way that there could be some interesting stuff coming out of that? Does that make any sense to you?
I don't know really. I mean, I sometimes wonder what I would do if I mean, you know, being at a newspaper for that length of time is rather comfortable. If that all ended, I really don't know what I would do. Would I carry on doing this? Would I want to move on to something else? I don't know. I don't even know if I would want to continue being a photographer or not. Really? It's interesting because ultimately, if you don't feel, I mean, for me, photography was I wanted to do something important. Yeah. You know, and sure, I could, you know, make a living, you know, being a reportage wedding photographer. I mean, I know people that do it who do rather well out of it, or, you know, I can do PR work and, you know, photograph people clinking glasses and doing speeches and whatever, but you know, you can do a little bit of that. But if that's, for me personally, if that was the mainstay of my work, I think I would find it rather unbearable. And that's no criticism of the people that do it, because, you know, everybody does things for different reasons. But for me, if I wasn't mentally stimulated by what I was doing, I think I would perhaps maybe move over to something else that does. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, absolutely.
God knows what it would be. That's the problem.
I'm going to betray something, you know, conversations that we've had in the past where you felt that you were coming, you know, you might be approaching the end of regular employment at the Telegraph or whatever, and you have been worried about that for some time, but it hasn't happened yet. Which means...
No, I mean, I've been very fortunate. I mean, we still have a core of very good photographers there, and I mean, luckily, I mean, it's sad in some respects, but the more right-wing media are still doing quite well, as opposed to the sort of the middle of the road and left-wing media who seem to be doing really badly. So at the moment, things still look okay, and I still do interesting work. And yeah, like I said, you know, when the job's good, it's the best job in the world.
Yeah.
I've travelled across the globe. I've met amazing people. You get to see things that ordinary people don't. Not that I'm not an ordinary person, but in my job, you know, I mean, I sit in a room with the Prime Minister, and you know, I meet famous football players. If I was interested in football, it would probably be quite exciting. You know, I go to far-flung places, and I hope it's made me a better person than I was in some respects. You know, because it certainly broadens your outlook.
But I think, I mean, just going into that sort of back into that world where you're in covering conflict, which is different from almost every other kind of photography, because you're a participant in it, and that's what I've always thought was, you know, if you're sent somewhere to cover, say, almost any other story where there's a degree of control in the environment, you know, which is pretty much every other story. When you're in a conflict situation, there's no control. I mean, there is you're in a lawless, well, you know, de facto lawless state, perhaps, or you're not in control of where you're going to be from one day to the next, and so forth. What I'm interested in is the transition from normal person into that sort of person, or the person that is doing that job. You know, what goes on inside, and whether or not what you would, if you could describe that in any way. You know, from the moment you leave home, you get on the plane, and you get off wherever you're going, and so on. There must be a period of transition and a sort of mental preparing.
Yeah, I know my partner. I mean, she basically says that there's no point in really there being much communication, and I think that probably the 24 to 36 hours before I go somewhere, if I have any warning beforehand, because I'm just constantly unpacking and repacking my kit, and my mind's already elsewhere, which I think is probably quite hard for her, and probably my children too. But it's
So if you could take me through what happens. So if you're
you get a call from the office. Usually, you know, hopefully you get a couple of days' notice, and and often you kind of know what's going on already, and you get asked if you can go. Sometimes you're meeting a reporter there, sometimes you're travelling with somebody, and I mean, some of it's done for you. You know, they'll book a flight for you and whatever, but then, you know, you can just turn up with no idea at all. I mean, I think an example, a good example of the extremes would be, say, for instance, in 2001 I was in New York covering New York Fashion Week for the Telegraph, and at that point I was doing all their catwalk because of who I'd worked for previously. And I got a call from the office, can you go travel down to the World Trade Center? We've heard a report that a plane's hit it. And I thought, oh, okay. So I got my gear together and got my monopod and my flight case, thinking, well, I'll go down there and there's probably a light aircraft has collided with the building or something. I'll take a few pictures and then go off and cover my first fashion show of the day. And obviously it didn't. That wasn't the case. And that morning kind of changed my life for the next 10 years or so. And after a couple of weeks in New York, I got sent off to. Well, I asked if I could go to Afghanistan.
And before you move on to that, I think it would be great to hear what it was like to be there when that happened.
It still doesn't seem real,
right?
To be honest, I was staying at this hotel called the Royalton in Midtown Manhattan, and I got downstairs, jumped in a taxi that was outside, and said, "Can you take me to the World Trade Center?" And he was this sort of grey bearded guy with a baseball cap, and he said, "Get out of my cab, man!" And he was like really quite angry with me, and I didn't really know why. And jumped into another taxi, and he seemed absolutely fine, and started driving, I think, down Broadway. And then I could see these two towers smoking, and I think maybe what had happened is during my sort of transition down through the building and into the first taxi, that the second plane must have hit. And I then, got as far as I could in the car. At that point, I didn't really understand the geography of the World Trade Center. I'd never been to it. I sort of walked around Battery Park and stuff, but I didn't know the streets particularly well and where to go. And came across a police checkpoint, and they'd closed off the road, and people were just, eating sandwiches, sitting on car roofs, sort of looking at the scene with binoculars. It was all still pretty, calm. There were people coming out covered in dust and being led away to ambulances, but in general, the scene was fairly calm. And it was only when the first tower collapsed that there was a little bit of panic.
How close were you when that went?
I don't know. A few blocks away. Close enough that when the second tower collapsed, the dust started, coming down the street towards us, and that's when the checkpoint sort of stopped and everyone ran away, and that was my opportunity to run in the opposite direction to where everybody else was running. So I ran towards the scene and I was just walking through the rubble, and there was dust everywhere, and I'd torn off my vest under my shirt and turned it into a kind of bandana mask and gave the other half of it to this camera woman, because there was this caustic dust and you could feel it burning your skin. And she was discussing, we should get down into the metro, and there's a station under the World Trade Center if we go through the tunnels. And I was a bit like, I'm not too sure if that's a good idea or not, So she went one way and I went another, and there were sort of like firemen's equipment lying in the rubble, like masks and oxygen tanks just lying there. And I remember these, like, they were bleeping, sort of, like, I guess the carbon monoxide alarms in them going off or whatever. It was odd, and there were like flames sprouting out of the ground, and it reminded me, it sounds a bit naff, but it reminded me of that Kubrick film that was filmed in Docklands, the Vietnam film, Full Metal Jacket, when I remember when I watched that film, I thought, God, this looks so unrealistic, and it just, I don't know, it just jogged a memory, and it didn't look real. It did not look real, and and then I got to the base of the building, and there were firemen. Some of them were working from crushed vehicles. And then there was one guy who was just sitting there in a state of shock. Another fireman with his head in his hands. And these were the firemen who'd survived the collapse of the buildings. All of their colleagues, was there 300 or 400 of them had died inside. They were the ones who'd survived, and some of them had found somewhere within them the will to carry on working. And like from these crushed engines, you know, I mean, they were still working, and others, you know, had given up. And I did what I could. You know, I had this, you know, 2 megapixel press camera with, gosh, I mean, our memory cards then I think were 160 megabyte cards.
Right.
Just tiny.
Yeah.
And I shot as much as I could. And then I think I started to think, God, you know, the time difference between London and New York was pretty big.
Yeah.
That I'd have to get out of there, which I've always regretted ever since. I still think about it now. But then, you know, I had no choice really. You know, if I'd stayed, I'd have had to have started going through my pictures and deleting pictures to make space to take more pictures. And so I left, and some kind New Yorker actually gave me a lift uptown. I mean, I was covered in dust.
How long were you in the zone for?
I don't know. I don't know what time I got down there. I mean, it was, you know, was it 9:30, 10 o'clock in the morning or something? I can't remember now. So I was there for a couple of hours. And
so what happened then? What happened?
Well, then I was stuck there for like 2 weeks, and I was with it.
No, I mean with those pictures.
With those pictures, well, I sent them to the office. You know, I got back, and I phoned the desk from my hotel room, and the first thing the picture I said was, "Thank God you're still alive," because he had no idea. I mean, my mobile wasn't working. You couldn't get a line out.
Because the last thing they heard is go there.
Yeah, they said go and have a look.
And
you know, several hours later, they hadn't heard anything, and you know, and I sent my pictures, and I had a nice picture in the paper the following day of somebody looking sort of stunned and looking up to where the towers would have been, I guess, you know, blood on his shirt and covered in dust, and with an Associated Press byline on it, you know. Because I think, you know, everyone in London was panicking, thinking they were next, and, you know, I think, you know, making sure that the right photographer's name was on the right picture wasn't probably high on their list of priorities at the time. So, I mean, I laughed at it. It was quite funny.
But just when you were talking about the fireman that you found on the scene, I could see that it's still very powerfully emotional.
Yeah, it is. But I mean, but they were the only human connection, because everyone had been vaporized. You know. I mean, I'm sure if I looked hard enough, I might have found a finger or something in the rubble. You know, but it was, you know, in general, everything was, you know, people. You know, it was 1,000 degrees or whatever in that building. I mean, it wasn't like I don't know, sort of being on the ground in Sierra Leone and there are sort of, you know, dead bloated bodies around you and stuff. It's not. It's different. It was like being on a movie set.
Yeah, it was just not normal. I mean,
it was so completely unreal. You're in this big, you know, metropolis, you know, the most famous city in the world, and suddenly you were surrounded by rubble and dust, and no, it just didn't seem real. It still doesn't, to be honest.
I mean, listening to you talk, I feel emotional too. Actually, yeah, because of course I've listened to other people talking about that, but it occurred to me that just from something that you said, that those firemen were in fact the link between the living and the dead. In fact, quite literally and metaphorically in a way. The way you described them was that they were there before the towers crashed, and then they were there afterwards. Although some of them, you know, weren't, and that was the tragedy. That was the link to the tragedy, because everything else was unrecognizable for you. I mean, that's the sense I got from what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, it's so. Back to the and you've sent your pictures, and you're locked in New York for some time. I mean, and did that moment start a sort of quest? I mean, because there was such a sort of fallout from that moment. You know, I mean, Afghanistan, and you know, the American response, and so on, and that must have changed your working life, because you really followed the conflict from thereafter.
Yeah, completely. I mean, after that I was in New York for a couple of weeks, and they made me stay there was a memorial service at the Bronx Stadium. So I was there for about 2 weeks, and once that was over I came home, I think for 24 hours max, and then went straight off, I think, to, where did I go? I had to go to Berlin to get a visa for Tajikistan, and then straight over to Afghanistan. And that was when I had no idea what I was going to find. I mean, it was literally, I bumped into other friends of mine from around the world in...
Photographers?
Yeah, in Berlin. And I think we then moved on to Munich, and then got a flight from Munich to Dushanbe in Tajikistan, this place that I'd never heard of, to be honest. And it was like something out of a Tintin book. And, if there's any sort of example of how the Soviet Union has sucked the life out of its satellite states, it was Tajikistan. Really.
Right.
It's like, you look at an insect that's had, all of its bodily fluids sucked out of it by a big spider. It was that kind of nation. It's awful. And we drove in a convoy down to the Afghan border, and just, I don't think there was anyone with us at that point who'd ever been there before. And we just didn't have any idea at all what we'd find. How we would, I didn't know if I was just going to be sort of travelling on foot. So I was trying to organise my gear so that I could carry it all. So I was leaving stuff behind at the hotel in Tajikistan, thinking, well, I'm not going to be able to carry this much. If I have to travel on foot, then I've got to travel less. And at that point, I was already on digital, so it wasn't like in the old days we'd have to carry loads of film in a changing bag and chemicals and stuff. And we crossed over the river, the Darya, which is the border between Tajikistan and Afghanistan. Ended up in Afghanistan, and there were these, Afghan sort of mujahideen guys waiting for us, stuck us all in the back of Russian Kamaz trucks and took us to a compound, took our passports off us, and I spent a couple of nights there, and we really didn't know, what was going to happen next. We were kind of allowed out in the daytime, but they kept our passports. And it turned out it was the place where Ahmad Massoud, the sort of rebel commander, was assassinated by some Al-Qaeda guys posing as cameramen. So that was a bit odd. So I think I spent the first evening chatting to one of his security detail who'd basically been in a state of depression ever since, because the line of the Panjshir had been assassinated on his watch, and he just couldn't forgive himself. And then, from there I managed to sneak out. Actually, it was the reporter who I'd been with in Kosovo, who'd been working for the American paper, Matt McAllister.
Right.
He managed to steal back my passport and the passports of two other friends of mine, a guy called Moises Saman and another photographer called Tyler Hicks, who works in the New York Times. And we all managed to then get out. We slipped out that day and sort of then split off and went in separate directions. I managed bizarrely to find a Telegraph journalist who was just riding towards me on a pony in full Afghan clothing. And I was like, "Oh, fancy seeing you here." He was like, "Yeah, fancy seeing you here," And
who's that?
And we teamed up with a guy called Julius Strauss, who has given up the job since. But so.
And so that was into Afghanistan. And how long were you there then?
Couple of months.
Right.
Yeah. It was an incredible time. I think professionally, it was the best time of my life.
Okay, why?
Well, I think Afghanistan's such an extraordinary place and incredibly photogenic. And so I teamed up with Julius and someone else who's become a good friend of mine who works in New York, called John Lee Anderson, and a photographer who's represented by Magnum called Thomas Dvorak. And Thomas and I just spent every day walking around, finding a nice scene to photograph, and I learnt quite a lot from him because being a news photographer, really, every day you're just trying to get the picture and leave and file and then go on to the next thing, and suddenly you found yourself in a position where you've actually got time. We had weeks and weeks of this. We were waiting, we had weeks before even the first sort of Allied airstrikes started. So you were just there, and you would go out in the morning when the light was nice, come back, rest, go back out in the afternoon when the light was nice, and just work, and it was great. And then the story started moving. And
so what happened when the airstrikes started coming in?
Well, it's just, at that point, the Northern Alliance, who were fighting against the Taliban, started to kind of move forward, and that's when things started to change. And there was a handful of journalists got killed, and we had to sort of help get their bodies out of there, and that was quite stressful. So I still remember that. I remember being quite angry. Sometimes it still makes me angry when I think about it. But
why?
I don't know, really. I remember at the time being angry because the Afghans were being a bit funny and wanting payment just to sort of move their bodies down the road a little bit, and I don't know. So I guess it was a shock. They weren't even friends of mine, but I knew them. I'd been drinking tea with them the day before. We'd been living in the same area and used to see each other and stuff. But they weren't close friends. But I guess it was still quite a big thing. And
was that the first time you'd come up against something?
I think it was. Yeah, it was the first time. Well, it's the first and only time I've ever had to sort of hold a dead body in my arms, I think. And it was strange.
Well, there aren't many people who can.
No, but it's it was just one of those sort of moments where I'm just trying to describe it. I just remember being angry. I guess I was angry that it had happened. I was probably angry that they'd done what they'd done in the first place.
The journalists?
Yeah.
Did they put themselves in danger? Or?
Well, you always put yourselves in danger, and I think the thing is with journalism, conflict reporting, is that when it comes off and you get a good story and you're in one piece, you're a hero, and when it doesn't and something bad happens, then you're a sort of expletive. Can't really say, but that's the nature of it, really.
Yeah.
And I guess at the time they did something that I didn't feel comfortable with.
Did you know what they were going to be doing?
Yeah, I knew what they were going. They were going to visit a line of trenches which had just been liberated by the Northern Alliance. Apparently, all the Taliban had been killed, and it was a sort of the first in a sort of line of victories. And they were wrong, and they'd gone up on the back of this armoured personnel carrier to see these liberated trenches, but they hadn't been liberated, and they got gunned down on the back of these vehicles. It's awful,
And did you have a sense that about that?
No, I just thought, sod that, I'm not going up there. It's getting dark.
Oh, I see, right.
There'd been all this exchange of fire in the hours before that, artillery.
But you could have been on that.
Guns. Well, I could have.
If it was just a decision.
Yeah, it was a snap decision. You either go or you don't, and some people wanted to go and some didn't, and I didn't want to. The others did, and it could have been me. It could have been anybody. And I guess that's the difficult thing about it, really. It can just be, you're sucked into a story, and it's one of those things. And when you're in a story like that, obviously the story continued after Afghanistan. It was Iraq, and I went to Iraq during Saddam's time, and covered the weapons inspectors, and then covered the invasion and the aftermath and everything. And the longer you're in a story, the more difficult it is to leave that story. You want to see it through to its end, and which is why I'm glad that I never went to Syria. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, well, it does. Yeah,
because I was asked, and it was all a sort of, can you go to Syria in the morning kind of thing. And at that point, I hadn't even sort of thought about it enough whether I wanted to or not, and felt I hadn't had enough warning, or that enough preparation had been made to do the trip, so I turned it down. And it was only after that I realised that in fact I didn't want to go. So I just covered Libya, and I felt really uncomfortable in Libya because it was just completely bonkers.
Right.
And so I think not going to Syria early on made it a lot easier for me not to go there afterwards. Do you know what I mean? Because then you get sucked in.
Right.
I'm glad that I didn't get sucked in, because so many people not so many people, but people I know have lost their lives there. And
well, yeah, I mean, we've been recording for quite a long time.
Oops, sorry.
No, it's fascinating, and I could go on and on. But I just wanted to ask you, what if you've told me what constitutes a really awful day? What constitutes a good day in a situation like that?
Let me think of a good day. I had good days, during that time. I've had some fantastic days. When they thought that, was it 2006 or 2007, there was the first scare that Castro had either died or was about to die, and I got sent off to Cuba. And we, I think, rightfully decided that the best way to go in was via a package tour to Varadero, which is a sort of hellhole. And got into Varadero, and I went with a camera bag, and nobody checked anything, and I was really fortunate. And so we got in, and then moved straight to Havana. And a couple of days in, I was down on the Malecon, which is the seafront. Think like Brighton or something. There's this big stone seafront which was built by the Americans in the 1920s, and there were these dark storm clouds above, and all the locals were drunk on local rum and diving into the water off the rocks. And I just thought, wow, this is great. This is really good. And you just had a feeling. And I clambered down onto the rocks, and everyone was sort of cheery, probably because they were all pissed. Nobody was asking me for money, which is what they normally do. They want money to take, And I never give money to people.
Yeah.
I might hand a little bit of money to a child once I'm ready to leave an area, but I never, sort of give money if somebody asks. I just don't, because it just leads to trouble. And I just started shooting, and they were diving in the water, and I just knew it doesn't happen a lot. And you spend your whole life in that kind of a job, taking pictures and sometimes trying to make a picture out of whatever. But it was one of those times when I knew that I was in the right place and the light was right and everything. There are some photographers out there that can stage a beautiful picture and light it right and direct people, like lighting cameramen do, and you get photographers like that, and they work in studios and they're amazing. I'm not that sort of photographer. I can't do that, but I do know when something's right, and that was one of those moments, and that's when the job is at its best, really, because everything just sort of falls into place, and it lasts for a couple of minutes, and that's it.
Heathcliff, thank you very much.
No, pleasure.
That was brilliant.
Sorry for wittering on.
No, there was no wittering. I was completely caught in that. That was amazing. Thank you so much. That was brilliant. I could have gone on and on, but that was just wonderful. Thanks. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. Quite a shocking and moving conversation from my perspective. And please listen to it again. There was so much in there that's worth listening to. It might serve you well to check it out again. For other podcasts that we have posted at Photographica, you can find listings of those either on the Apple Store or on the Photographica website, which is asprinting.net/Photographica. That's asprinting.net/Photographica. Don't forget to check the program notes for for extra information regarding Heathcliff, and look forward to speaking to you next time. Thanks a lot for listening.